Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day in 2004, in the Pennsylvania Senate race, the conservative Pat Toomey is challenging moderate Republican incumbent Arlen Specter. It is a dynamic that just in the 10 years or so since has come to seem very normal. A primary race that features a more established, often more moderate candidate fending off a more ideological challenger from further to the right or the left, though it often does seem to be from the right. And sometimes when that primary challenger wins, they go on to be exposed as maybe not quite so ready for prime time as they get to the general election. This phenomenon is so common that it's kind of turned into a verb. To primary someone is now something we talk about in American politics. So let's talk about that 2004 Senate race, the origins of getting primaried, and what this dynamic in the primary system means for our democracy overall. And our special guest for this episode is Nick Troiano, author of The Primary Solution: Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringe. He is also executive director of Unite America, which is a group that invests in nonpartisan election reform. He joins us from Denver. Hello there, Nick. Thanks for doing this.
Great to be with you.
And here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Nick, the timing for this is actually quite nice for our show because we just finished a series that we called Hangers On Week, which was our look at primary candidates who stuck around for one reason or another and sometimes had a big impact on races even though they didn't win. But, the people we talked about were like the Alan Keys and Jesse Jacksons of the world, and that was mostly at the presidential level. But I feel like this dynamic that you wrote about, that we're talking about here, it's mostly kind of at the local level, the House and Senate, and then local elections, right?
Yes.
So where do you pin the beginning of it? I mean, do you want to start with that 2004 race? Does that feel like a good case study in when this started to be a real force in American politics?
It does. I mean, what's interesting is that primaries as we know them today, meaning the citizens being able to vote directly for who gets nominated from each political party, that was invented out of whole cloth a little over a century ago. Before then, it was sort of the party bosses in both parties in the proverbial smoke-filled rooms handpicking the candidates, and it was progressive era reforms that opened these contests up for direct voter participation. And for most of the 20th century, this was a rather innocuous exercise where people would be able to pick who the party's standard bearer would be. And once you got the nomination and were in office, really the only people who were challenged again from within their own party were because they got embroiled in a particular scandal or they weren't doing a good job sort of bringing home resources for their district. That began to change about 20 years ago in the early 2000s, and I pin it to this 2004 primary race in Pennsylvania, where Arlen Specter, who had been serving in the Senate since 1980, was challenged by a candidate named Pat Toomey, a name that will probably ring familiar to people. At the time, he was head of a conservative group called Club for Growth. And Specter was being challenged not because of a scandal or not because he wasn't doing his job, representing the state from the perspective of bringing home resources, but because he wasn't ideologically pure enough for the party that began to lurch further to the right. He voted, for example, against the budget-busting Bush tax cuts at the time, which was sort of anathema to the base. And so Toomey decided to step forward and challenge Specter. And Specter narrowly prevailed by a very small margin. It was 51 to 49%. But boy, did that send a shockwave through the Republican Party and through Congress to say, you better watch your ideological flank, because if you don't keep in line with where the activists in your party want you to be, you're going to be vulnerable to getting primaried. And that's when this whole idea of primary as a verb really began.
Yeah, this feels like the culmination of some changes that were happening, particularly in the 1990s. In the 1980s, people talked a lot about like Reagan Democrats and this big tent party, and, you know, the Republican Party takes all kinds. And in the 1990s, you start to get this move toward the more ideological extremes and ideological purity as a way of doing politics. And it's in the 90s where you get that idea of a Republican in name only. And once that idea gets popularized, once people are tarred as rhinos, then it's like, well, why should we have these moderates, non-conservatives in our party when we can just primary them and replace them? And once you have like an active base that's going to turn out for primary elections, who can be reached through right-wing media, who can make donations now that donation portals are starting to open online in 2004, you've got the ingredients for this political dynamic that I think is super familiar to us all now.
Yeah.
Yes.
It kills bipartisanship. Do you know what I mean? If there was any person that would have been sort of like on the fence, or, you know, like, maybe I can be persuaded. Like, now, if you don't tote that party line, you know, your job is on the line, essentially.
Yeah, and that's the dynamic, you know, I think that we often see within those kinds of candidates who have to go through the more extreme gauntlet of the primary, then end up in the general, and where you do have to appeal to a broader swath, and you end up with this disconnect. But staying kind of in that dynamic that emerged in the primaries themselves, I mean, Nikki, you kind of, I think you used the word stew, right? Like, it is all these ingredients, like money, media, the party system, all of these elements. Like, Nick, as you start to, how can I absolutely torture this metaphor? As you start to taste that stew, which of those flavors do you most think kind of defines the rotten stew that is the primary system?
Well, what I write about in the book is the sort of tectonic shifts in our politics that happened in the latter part of the 20th century in 1980s and 1990s. And what we saw was, first, both parties becoming more ideologically sorted. Lee Drutman, a political scientist, describes the fact that last century we had sort of four parties: conservative and liberal Republicans, conservative and liberal Democrats. By the early 2000s, and certainly today, most Republicans will identify as conservative. Most Democrats as more progressive, and so the primary system became sort of litmus test to judge, who is most pure ideologically. The second tectonic shift was our media landscape. We went from having a few news sources that most Americans got their sense of truth from to a very fragmented media environment in which we're basically stuck within our own echo chambers. When you layer those two shifts on top of our current electoral system, what we find is that primaries exacerbate this polarization because they have become a tool, and I think a weapon that's been used by the ideological fringes, the activists, the special interests, to move the parties more in their direction, because they realize that they don't have to be a majority. They can be a noisy 8% of the electorate, as they are today, to be able to make the decisions of who represents the party. Or if you're a special interest group, Club for Growth and Specter's race, but also MoveOn.org on the left, when Senator Lieberman was primaried out of the Democratic Party just a couple of years later in 2006, those groups realized, wow, we can achieve a lot of bang for our buck by spending a little bit of money in these primaries and move the parties more towards our single issues.
Yeah, this is also such an emblematic moment for the structures that are enabling this change. I mean, you mentioned Club for Growth and, of course, Toomey's ties to Club for Growth. But once you have these, not just ideological organizations, but deep-pocketed PACs who can organize around a candidate, who can have an insurgent campaign roll in with millions of dollars, it makes a big difference to how these things play out. So it's not just like an electorate that is more radicalized or more ideological, but it is a structure that allows for that. And it's so fitting that Toomey is a Club for Growth guy.
Yeah, and I would say, like, what's interesting is how sort of history comes full circle. He retired from the Senate in the last few years, in part because he was not conservative enough within his own party. Now it was the sort of MAGA faction of the Republican Party that essentially forced him into retirement. And so we see a lot of these leaders in both parties becoming victims of their own success. There's really no putting the toothpaste back in the tube of how sordid the parties have become. So I look at the design of the primary system as the biggest solvable problem when we look at the stew about what we can actually change. And that's what gives me some hope, because we've seen many states, successfully tackle this and move to a system that doesn't exacerbate these dynamics as much.
So as you start to think about solutions or sort of really understanding the dynamic at play, I mean, all of what we've been talking about is sort of predicated on the fact that during primaries, it has tended to be the most extreme and dedicated voters who actually turn up, right? I mean, if everyone showed up in primaries in the way they did in general elections, then maybe you would find a different dynamic. And so at some level, why is that the case? Why is it that only the most extreme voters show up during primaries? And at some level, is it just that the candidates are catering to the people who are actually showing up during these elections?
The biggest reason is that in most states, the rules of primaries dictate who can even participate, who even has access to the ballot. And in 2024, for example, in 22 states, more than 24 million independent voters will not be able to vote in either party's primary for president or Congress because they're not affiliated with any particular party. And so we see such low turnout in part because we don't allow a lot of people to participate. And then further, we have bifurcated the system in which you can only participate in either the red primary or the blue primary. In the general elections, you get to vote for any candidate. So that's a big reason why. And then, of course, it's earlier in the year. They get less attention. Most people would be deferential to others who pay more attention to politics to make these decisions. And so that contributes to the fact that we see very low turnout. In the book, I compare it to sort of who shows up to the tailgate before the sports match, right? And it's the biggest fans.
The people with their faces painted.
Exactly. And that's what we see among primary voters.
Yeah. I'm curious about another dynamic that has emerged and has led to another catchphrase, which is this idea of the nationalization of elections. And all elections are basically national elections at this point. And I wonder if this process you're describing also leads to a disconnect between the things that in theory we're electing our leaders to do, which is represent a local district and do things like bring money home for their district or care about the potholes in the road or the schools or so forth. And it seems like, and it has a lot to do with the media environment, but we have basically local representatives who really just care about going on national TV and talking about those kinds of issues. So are you seeing a kind of erosion of the incentives to really care about the stuff that happens at the local level as part of this process too?
Well, I do think that the biggest force driving politics today is so-called negative partisanship. It is people voting against the party they really don't like because of our media landscape, social media, et cetera, have really convinced us the other side is not just wrong, but evil. And so every election we have to, it's more existential. We have to save the country from, the bad guys. The promise of primary reform is getting to general elections with more than just a red and blue binary. If we had 4 candidates or 5 candidates from the same party, from different parties, from no party, then the campaigns that play out by definition can't just be zero-sum vote for me because I'm not the other person. There may be more than one of you from your party in the general election. So you actually have to campaign on what you stand for, what you want to do. And I think scrambling that 2-party binary is what holds promise of getting us out of this vicious cycle of partisanship that we're in today.
For the states, you had mentioned earlier that there are like 22 states where you can only have a Republican or Democrat on the ballot. So independents just can't vote at all in that primary. They have to wait for the general election. Is there a push to try to change some of that so that you can get third-party candidates on the ballot in any of those states?
Well, the push to change it is either to allow independents to choose which party's primary to participate in, or sort of our North Star in America is to replace the party primary system altogether with a nonpartisan all-candidate primary. So everybody gets the same ballot. All the candidates are listed with their party affiliation, and the top finishers go to the general election. Alaska is a good example. In 2020, they adopted this top 4 nonpartisan primary, which is the sort of most impactful version of this system. But other states like Maine and Colorado took that incremental step. They said at least independents should be able to participate. So states are making these changes, and they're able to do so because the Constitution gives them that ability. This doesn't require a constitutional amendment or act of Congress, which is why I'm so focused on this issue, because it's one that we can actually move the needle on and is happening in real time.
Can I ask you a nerdy, nitty-gritty question? I love that idea of having like 4 or 5 candidates on the ballot. Does that obviate the need for something like ranked choice voting, or does doing ranked choice voting on top of that make it like exponentially more small d democratic?
Having multiple candidates in the general election is what necessitates ranked choice voting, because you would want to ensure that one of those candidates wins majority support, that you don't wind up electing someone with 33% of the vote that a majority of voters might not want. And so the combination of a top 4 primary with instant runoff in the general elections that use a ranked ballot is the powerful combination of these reforms that ensure the candidates who are running have to campaign to the whole electorate. And when they're in office, they have to represent a majority of their constituents if they want to get elected, which can help break the pathology in our politics right now, in which most of our leaders only are representing the 8 or 10% of voters that are deciding if they get to go back to Congress or not.
So as we wrap up, I know you hinted at it a little bit, but do you want to give people a little primer on how to watch this election or get involved in this election coming up? I mean, are there particular ballot initiatives that you got your eye on? Or moreover, are there any like particular primaries where you see, whoever the Christine O'Donnell of 2024 is, to say, oh gosh, there's that dynamic playing out?
Yeah. Well, I think first, my encouragement is to participate in primaries. 83% of congressional seats are effectively determined in the primary. So chances are, wherever you live, if you're not voting in the primary and only showing up in November, that election is over before it even begins. So vote in the primary. Second, let's change the primary, because it doesn't have to be that way. And this year, in 2024, we're seeing upwards of a half dozen states move initiatives to the ballot that would fix the system. A good example of this is in Nevada, which is positioned to be the next state after Alaska to adopt a top 4 or 5 primary system. It already won once on the ballot in 2022. Their state requires it to win twice before it takes effect. So if you're in Nevada, you will have that opportunity. Other states pursuing this include Colorado, Idaho, Montana, South Dakota. And I think this year can be actually the biggest year since the progressive era 100 years ago, where we can see meaningful change to the way that we elect our leaders. And I would posit that if you ask me, would you rather, pull a lever and change all 535 members of Congress, or pull a lever and change how we elect them? I'm much more in the latter camp, because the current way that we do things keeps feeding good people into a broken system. And until we change the incentives, we're going to continue to be disappointed with the outcomes that we see.
All right. Well, the book is The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringe. It is out now. Nick Choriano is the executive director of Unite America. So thanks so much for doing this, and thanks for writing that book.
Great to be with you.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
It is, as you may have heard, an election year. But do you feel like you have a lot of choices? Here are the new candidates, same as the old candidates. How did we get here again? The fact is, our democracy is broken. We can all feel it, and there's data to back it up, too. A Princeton University study found that public opinion has near zero impact on what laws are passed. It does have an impact, though? money. You can call it lobbying, you can call it super PAC spending, you can call it corruption. But luckily, there are things we can do right now to fix this broken system. This podcast is part of the Pro-Democracy Podcast Coalition, a group that's banding together to make our democracy better. We're working with Represent Us, the largest grassroots organization fighting to end corruption city by city and state by state. You can join the movement too. Go to represent.us/podcast to find out more.
Radiotopia.